Hello and very welcome. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in the stories. I am Miles. I was born into a large family with a modest financial situation. Because there were so many siblings, my parents couldn't give everyone full attention. From a young age, everyone knew I was a mischievous kid. Wherever I went, I always caused some trouble, which led my mom to constantly scold me or remind me that I wasn't a good child. When I started school, my mom always emphasized studying hard so I could make something of myself. But I wasn't very receptive. I was more focused on finding an easy job someday that would earn me a good income and let me live a comfortable life. My older brother always said that making money is never easy, and you have to work hard for it, unless you inherit wealth or have strong financial backing, which we didn't. Our dad could barely support himself and my mom, let alone more than that. By the time I entered middle school, I was already quite restless. I mostly hung out with older boys, some of whom encouraged me to talk to girls. That's how my interactions with the opposite gender started at a young age. It felt like I was trying to compensate for the lack of confidence I had because of our financial struggles. My parents weren't particularly happy with me, and my dad often said that he tried his best to provide for all of us. He found it hard when one of his children stood against him, especially since my other siblings were always appreciative of my parents, unlike me. I would constantly complain, saying that if they couldn't afford to, they shouldn't have had so many kids. My siblings, on the other hand, always said that no matter what, having parents was a blessing. At the time, I was too young to understand their perspective. I often argued with my parents and went against their wishes. Once, my brother caught me walking in the park with a girl. He immediately confronted me, took me home, and lectured me on how I was too young to be involved in relationships and should focus on my studies to secure my future. But I didn't listen to any of his advice. Eventually, my family stopped trying to guide me, realizing I wasn't someone who would listen to others and that I would do whatever I believed was right. Most people in our extended family ended up marrying within the family. My cousin Negan had feelings for me, but I didn't feel the same way about her. My sister would occasionally remind me to treat Negan kindly so she wouldn't lose hope in me. I would tell them that I had plans for my life and didn't want to marry a relative. Though Negan was a great person, smarter and more ambitious than me, I couldn't bring myself to be interested in her. Sometimes her success made me feel inferior, as she was focused and goal-oriented, unlike the girls I used to spend time with. As I grew older and entered my final years of high school, my brother would constantly urge me to at least try to get into a good university. But I still didn't put in any effort, while my cousin got into the best university in Tehran. I decided to start working instead. Since I'd heard that buying and selling real estate was lucrative, I chose to enter that field. The company that hired me initially said I needed to work as an intern for a month because I lacked experience. I had no problem with the 1-month internship. During that time, I mostly accompanied clients to view houses and didn't earn any commission, just a small percentage as a token amount. When the owner of the real estate office saw how well I was doing, especially how good I was at attracting customers, he hired me permanently and offered me a decent salary. This motivated me to work even harder. On top of my fixed salary, I earned a good amount of money for every house I helped sell or buy. Within a few months, I managed to buy a car for myself. However, my mother wasn't happy about my job, and even my brother tried to convince me to quit, but I refused. One day, I had a client who was an older Iraqi man. From the moment we met, he was very warm and talkative. The house he was looking for was large and luxurious. On the first day, I was struck by how friendly he was. He kept complimenting me, praising my appearance, and telling me how wise I was to have chosen such a great career at a young age. The second time he came to view new houses, he asked me if I was married. I denied it, laughing and saying I was still too young. He joked and said, "Even if it's my daughter, you wouldn't agree?" I laughed it off, thinking it was just harmless banter. After all, no one would joke like that about their own daughter in front of a stranger. I showed him one of the nicest houses we had, and he loved it. He decided to bring his wife and daughter the next day to finalize the purchase. Here's a revised version of the text with inappropriate and unnecessary parts removed, while keeping the story coherent. The Iraqi man was friendly and seemed genuinely interested in forming a bond with me. After he approved of the house and decided to buy it, he brought up the idea of me marrying his daughter, Mariam. He spoke highly of me, saying he would be honored to have me as a son-in-law. His compliments boosted my confidence, but I wasn't sure how serious he was. A few days later, he returned to look for another house for a friend. During the drive, he brought up the topic of marriage again. He explained that he was worried about his daughter's future and wanted her to marry someone he trusted. He assured me that he didn't care about financial arrangements and only wanted what was best for Mariam. His enthusiasm made me curious, so I asked him why he was so eager for this marriage. He laughed and said, "There's nothing wrong with her. I just want her to settle down with someone reliable, and I see that in you." His words were surprisingly persuasive. He spoke with such warmth and sincerity that I couldn't help but feel flattered. I had never experienced this level of support or appreciation from anyone outside my family. It made me think I was ready to start a life of my own. Later that day, I discussed the matter with my brother, explaining everything that had happened and showing him the picture of Mariam that the Iraqi man had sent me. My brother listened carefully but didn't seem convinced. He warned me that rushing into marriage, especially with someone we didn't know, could be risky. When he tried to reason with me, I became defensive, accusing my family of always doubting me and undermining my decisions. I insisted that this was my choice and that I wanted to take control of my future. Despite my outburst, my brother remained calm and tried to show his concern for me, but I stormed out without listening. That evening, I spoke to my mother about the proposal. While she was hesitant, she didn't completely dismiss the idea. Instead, she brought up Negan, a girl from our family, as a potential match. She questioned why I wanted to marry outside the family when there were suitable options closer to home. After some discussion, I insisted that my family support my decision, warning them that I might proceed without their approval. Eventually, arrangements were made, and we went to Mariam's family to formally ask for her hand in marriage. However, my mother and the rest of my family were not fully supportive after that first visit. Luckily, the Iraqi man knew about my family situation because I had confided in him, telling him how my family had always been critical of me. It seemed he used that information to his advantage, telling me it didn't matter if my family wasn't deeply involved in the marriage process. Things moved quickly, and Mariam and I were married. Strangely, Mariam didn't seem to care much about the marriage, and I could even say she seemed unwilling. After the marriage, I began trying to build a connection with the Iraqi man's wife, Hannah. She didn't reject my advances and seemed open to a relationship. In a way, my marriage to Miriam became a bridge to reaching Hannah. After the wedding, Miriam and the Iraqi man moved out of the house, leaving me and Hannah alone. The Iraqi man deliberately left the house for me and his wife to spend time together. That was when I had my first encounter with Hannah. It was such an intense experience that I couldn't believe someone that much older than me could captivate me like that. After I was done with Hannah, I called the Iraqi man, whom I addressed as Mr. Bozorgi, out of respect. Later, I took Miriam to my family's house as a formality so they could meet her, and Miriam kissed their hands as a gesture of respect. Since my family was known for being polite and well-mannered, they behaved graciously. That's why my family treated Miriam kindly and welcomed her warmly, even though my brother kept telling me that I had made a mistake and would eventually regret it. Despite his warnings, I didn't care about their opinions, thinking my family didn't want the best for me. Later that night, I told Mr. Bozorgi that Miriam and I would be staying at a hotel. That same evening, after having been with Hannah earlier, I invited Mariam to the hotel, where we had our first intimate moment as husband and wife. Mariam was a very beautiful girl, and her athletic background had given her a great figure. I was quite satisfied with her. Still, it was surprising how Mariam had no issue with me being involved with her mother. She knew everything, and her father had even told her that, as part of this marriage arrangement, they'd buy me a house. I had never seen someone spend so much on a marriage arrangement. The next day, when I went to visit my family, all the relatives were there. My mother pulled me aside in the kitchen to share her feelings, telling me that Negan was heartbroken and deeply upset about me marrying someone else. At that moment, it didn't matter to me. I didn't understand the value of deep love. I thought everything could be bought with money, but I didn't realize that some things, like love and someone's heart, couldn't be purchased. Even if I became a billionaire, I couldn't buy someone's true affection. But back then, I didn't care. I even brought Miriam to the gathering that day to introduce her to everyone. A few days later, Mr. Bozorgi bought a house for me in one of the nicer neighborhoods and put it in my name. I decided that Miriam and I would move in and start our life there immediately, despite my family's opposition. Without holding a wedding ceremony, we moved into the new house. During this time, I continued my relationship with Hannah. Even the bedroom we furnished was designed according to Hannah's preferences. For several months after marrying Miriam, I maintained a simultaneous relationship with Hannah. Sometimes I even invited Hannah to my house so both women were there together. Eventually, Mr. Bozorgi reduced contact with me, and Hannah began staying at my house more frequently. One day, I called him to suggest that he should spend more time with his wife. He told me he wasn't in Iran and had gone to Iraq but would return soon. A month passed and the Iraqi man didn't return. Even the money he used to send stopped coming. It became harder to keep both women content, especially since there was no real love or emotional connection. Everything was based on desire and impulse. Since my marriage, my relationship with my family had significantly weakened. This was difficult for me because, despite our differences, my family had always supported me. It was a tough time, and my pride wouldn't let me make the first move to reconcile with them. One day, feeling overwhelmed, I called my brother and visited him. I told him that I already regretted my marriage and felt that Miriam and I were not a good match. My brother advised me to stick to the decision I had made, saying it wasn't fair to ruin Miriam's reputation so soon after the marriage. When I returned home that day, I found Miriam and Hannah acting as if everything was normal, even though neither of them seemed bothered by Mr. Bozorgi's absence. I told Hannah it was time for her to leave, but she rudely responded, saying this was also her house and she wouldn't leave until her husband returned. Frustrated, I snapped and said, "Maybe your husband died in Iraq. That's why he hasn't come back yet." Hannah became furious and said, "This is why women can't trust men. You ruin women's lives." I couldn't understand the full depth of her words. After Hannah left, Miriam turned to me and asked why I had agreed to marry her while being involved with her mother at the same time. I decided to tell her the truth. It was because of the money. Miriam laughed and said her father's only asset was his wealth. He had no real character. I was shocked by what Miriam said about her own father. I tried to defend him, saying, "I think your father is a man of character too." But Miriam broke down, saying, "You don't know anything about the reality of my father. He can only keep people around him with his charm and money, just like he did with you." I didn't interrupt her as she continued, saying, "My father has a wife and children back in Iraq. He's gone back to them now and has left me and my mother in your hands." Hearing this completely changed my perspective. I was very angry because the Iraqi man had promised to support me financially, not just give me a house and leave. Hearing the truth made me furious. I broke everything within my reach and said that if this was the reality, I could no longer live under the same roof with them. I'm not the kind of man who can constantly maintain relationships with two people. Besides, from what I had learned before, Hannah was the type of woman who had relationships with multiple men, and I couldn't accept having her continually involved in my life. After saying those words, I called the Iraqi man, but he didn't answer my calls. I sent him a text telling him that I would divorce his daughter and keep the house for myself. However, I received no response. A few days passed, and during that time I stayed with a friend. Still, there was no news from the man. Finally, I decided to tell my brother the whole truth about what had happened. As always, my brother listened to my story without judgment. This time, he didn't even criticize me. Instead, he told me that if I realized my mistake, it wasn't too late to correct it. Encouraged by his words, I went through the difficult process of divorcing Miriam. At first, there was a lot of drama. They kept coming to our house, making a scene, and almost everyone found out about the nature of my marriage to Miriam. Despite this, my brother stood by me and supported me. Even my mother cried for me because my life had fallen apart. At that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. I realized how much I had taken my family for granted. I always thought they were against me and didn't love me, but despite how disrespectful I had been to them, they still opened their doors to me. After I started feeling a little better, I sold the house the Iraqi man had bought for me and used the money to buy a small house near my family's place, which I rented out temporarily because I wasn't ready to live there alone. The first thing I did after that was seek my parents' forgiveness. I apologized for all the pain I had caused them. My mother told me that a parent never holds a grudge against their child, no matter how rebellious they are. My brother also said that he considered me like his own son and valued me just as much. He never wanted to see me unhappy. Once I started to recover emotionally, I quit the shady business of buying and selling properties and began working alongside my brother at his mobile repair shop to learn the trade. After the blows I had suffered, I didn't want to get involved with anyone again. Then one day, months after my divorce, my mother brought up the subject of Negan again. She told me that Negan was still willing to marry me. She said Negan didn't care that I had been married before or that I was divorced. She still accepted me. When I heard this, I initially wanted to refuse, as I always had, but this time I decided to listen to my family and trust their wisdom. I agreed to the proposal, and with my family's support, we went to Negan's house for the formal engagement. Everyone in the family was overjoyed, and my parents constantly prayed for our happiness. Negan didn't even ask a single question about my past. She said she had always loved me and accepted me for who I was. Since we were relatives, we decided to have a small engagement ceremony and move into our new home right away. I was a much calmer and more mature person by then. My recklessness and mischief from the past were gone, because I had learned the hard way how important it is to seek advice and guidance. I realized that stubbornness and defiance never lead to success. Now, years have passed since Negan and I started our life together. At first, I didn't feel a deep connection with her, but her constant kindness and affection won me over. Today, I am deeply in love with her, and together we are raising our daughter Nagar, who has become the center of our world. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I regret the past and wish I had devoted my life to Negan from the beginning. But I've also learned that sometimes our mistakes teach us to appreciate the right choices we eventually make. If I hadn't made those mistakes, I might never have realized the value of my life with Negan. After everything that happened, I never heard from the Iraqi man again, and neither Miriam nor Hannah tried to contact me. I suspected they would just find another naive man to manipulate. The biggest lesson I learned was that the greatest mistake a person can make is fighting against their own family and thinking they are the enemy. I realized this truth late, but as my brother once told me, whenever you realize your mistakes, it's better to turn back than to keep walking down the wrong path.